And the thing is, Tim, while a lot of people have heard of the movie or the book Brave New World, there's a lot of mystery and intrigue surrounding its author, Aldous Huxley. And Cynthia Chung at Strategic Culture Foundation has just finished a 4-part series. I would call it really a deep dive, but she really digs into not only the mechanics of it, but exploring the themes of dystopia, what in the common culture nowadays people talk about predictive programming, right? And to the extent that a lot of these things that we're seeing, because we're talking about, of course, the Great Reset and this mystery illness going around, and how do governments respond to it? What is the future going to look like? And so much of these ideas are kind of like contained, in this work that it almost it really opens the door and really begs the question, what that's all about, and is this an elite plan? How deep does it go? And so I'm really excited to talk with Cynthia today. Tim, I know that you've dug in and read the pieces. Do you have some thoughts to lead us
Well,
in
I
with?
just like to say is that in a lot of ways, one man's dystopia is another man's utopia. And I think that that's kind of maybe the underlying message, where when you're a teenager or in your 20s and you're in college and you read Huxley for the first time, you might see it as this sort of the Brave New World as being something, I don't know, gross or to be avoided, or for us who are sort of at the bottom of the scale of society, something that's kind of scary, needs to be avoided. But he seems to write with a bit of optimism. He seems to kind of portray this as being all well and good. But I think Cynthia could describe this much better. So maybe, Cynthia, let's get just into the overall. Well, why did you decide to write this sort of massive breakdown of the life and works of
Great
Aldous
question.
Huxley?
Great question. Yes.
I really wasn't planning on it being a 4-part series, and I actually learned quite a bit doing research for the paper. And I always wanted to do something on Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, because it's so influential. But I found that people were getting very mixed, messages from the book. Also, if you listen to Huxley's Ultimate Revolution, the Berkeley speech, if you look at the YouTube comments, so many people are like, "Wow, what a wonderful man!" I mean, he was really so ahead of his time, and he really saw ahead, like, all of the bad that was going to happen in our society. And I knew that that wasn't what Huxley's intention was, but I myself didn't fully know the whole background as well. And I would say that, in order to understand the Brave New World, you really do have to, first of all, know what was influencing Aldous, which T.H. Huxley is most definitely something that you have to understand, what he did to reform science, but not just reform science, but, there was, if you read the works of like H.G. Wells or Bertrand Russell, which also played prominent roles in, almost to the point where Aldous was kind of borrowing a lot to borderline plagiarizing.
Fascinating.
Particularly Bertrand Russell's Scientific Outlook. There's a letter between him and his editor where he even was contemplating charging Aldous. They didn't get along when Aldous was much younger, but then they started to gel more later on. But if you look at how H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell speak, they're talking about the switching of the old guard with the new guard. And T.H. Huxley was the one to start that reformation, where it was still an imperial outlook, but they realized that that old imperial outlook was losing the battle to what largely the United States was coming out as an industrial powerhouse. But you saw with Tsar Alexander II was also going along with this. There was the Meiji Restoration, and quickly after too, the Sun Yat-sen's adoption of Lincoln policy. So this was always meant to be in its best form under Henry C. Carey and so forth, an international industrialization.
Stop you
Yeah,
over
this
here.
is
So you're saying-
fascinating, but there's so much
wait,
happening at once. We want to untangle this.
Sorry.
So now,
Okay, so we're
let me
going.
say, Tim.
Yeah,
well,
if you're
well,
going from old guard to new
yeah,
guard, so
right.
who,
but wait, hold
Yeah.
on. This is
Okay.
fascinating. Wow, this is
Yeah.
awesome.
Joaquin's pumped.
So let me ask, Cynthia. So you mentioned another Huxley. Didn't sound like Aldous. So you said T.H. Huxley.
Mhm.
Is who is that? Is that the?
Yeah, T.H. Huxley is a Darwin's bulldog. So in part two of my series, I go through pretty much all of that and what Darwinism did in terms of reforming science, which, by the way, T.H. Huxley never was really fully on board with this, but he found it useful.
Any
Which,
relation to Aldous Huxley?
sorry, he's the grandfather. He's the
So
There we go.
grandfather
T.H.
of
Huxley
Aldous
is the
Huxley.
grandfather of Aldous Huxley, and
Yeah.
he was like Charles Darwin's attack dog.
Yeah, and because Darwin wasn't very good in debates, and also his theory has a lot of holes in it, and so T.H. Huxley was very sophistical, sophistry styled debates, so that it was very quickly it took hold, and what that did for science was that it denied purpose all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm.
It denied the existence of God and within the realm of science, because before, scientists, it was more common for scientists to believe in God and to believe that there was a purpose within the universe when they were working on whatever scientific hypothesis they were working on. Now under Darwinism, which reformed like everything, it was random, had no purpose, there was no God, and man was but a beast. And Aldous Huxley and Julian Huxley were raised in a household where their father wasn't anything very special. He mostly focused on writing about T.H. Huxley and Darwin, but T.H. Huxley was like a god in their household, and it was really the expectation that they were going to continue that massive legacy. So it's really important when you regard what's motivating Julian, what's motivating Aldous, and everything that they do is to continue that legacy of T.H. Huxley. And again, T.H. Huxley was a major leader in the transition from the old guard to the new guard, and H.G. Wells was a disciple of T.H. Huxley.
So that's Tim's question now. So you want to break down old guard and new guard? Because I happen to know that, as you said, up until about the middle of the 19th century, there wasn't this science versus religion debate. In fact, and as you know very well, and as actually you've written about in the past, the sciences actually grew out of the church, and all of the original scientists, at least in the Western European tradition, or in the Islamic Renaissance as well, were religious scholars as well. So tell us about this old guard versus new guard as we move forward, because this is just fascinating, fantastic.
Yeah, and I just want to add, scientists like Leibniz, or Kepler, they wouldn't have been able to be as powerful as they were if they didn't believe in a God. It doesn't have to be whether you're Christian or Muslim or so forth, but just that you approach everything in the universe as having a purpose, and that it's a moral purpose, which is very important. For the old guard, it was losing because it was using the old techniques of basically just brute force type of warfare. Like you can study the Roman Empire, you can study these types of ways of choking resources, and the British Empire had a naval power, so it had control over all of the choke points in terms of the transportation over water. But what the industrialization did was that it made that moot, basically, because if you had rail lines, all of those choke points wouldn't mean as much. I mean, it's still important, but they would lose a lot of their power, and they weren't really able to compete at that point. And so with the new guard, they started to have more of a kind of cultural warfare aspect, which was a major one, and an attack on the sciences, which was an international plan. It wasn't just for the Western sphere, and it did influence Russia and China as well. But that's a heavy topic, maybe for another time. But
We'll
the
definitely
new
have you on to talk about that. That's
I'm always up for Russia
I'm
talk.
intrigued. Yeah, I'm all in.
but the new guard took like basically a longer approach. So if you read like H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, which are very much like the after T.H. Huxley, they're like the really big figures in this, I would say. They're always talking about the future 50 years from now, 100 years from now, this is what it'll be. And they're very confident about it because they're laying out all of these behind the scenes setups so that they're quite confident it will work out. And this actually links up with the James Burnham managerial revolution paper that I had written as well, which is that this was really focused on creating a manager society. So scientists, now science was to be the new managers, or how H.G. Wells talks about the engineers are going to be the new managers of society. They're the technocrats, you could say.
That's a technocracy. Yeah.
Well, yeah, well, just to jump in then, but for what purpose then? To maintain the British Empire, a global empire? What's sort of the underlining motivation to do that?
It is definitely to keep empire, and the British Empire plays a major role in this. I mean, Cambridge, Oxford, the London School of Economics, these are all major players, and they have an international program, right? The Rhodes Scholarship is meant to very much infect that philosophy worldwide. But I mean, I would say that, there are oligarchs all around the world, and they kind of share in the same philosophy, which is this Great Reset. Philosophy that we see taking shape today. And so they're all kind of in the same bandwagon in that sense. But I would say that the British Empire is what created this intellectual package. Yeah.
Okay, so go on from then. So we're sort of approaching this almost shift between like the Victorian era into World War One, World War Two. So
Yeah, let me try to wrap my head around that too, Tim. So just to sort of to recap, so we're talking about Aldous Huxley. People are familiar with Brave New World. It's a strange dystopic novel, science fiction novel, if you will, that when people read it or see the movie, they don't tend to think, hey, this is the kind of world I want to live in. They tend to think like this is kind of bad, right? So it makes sense on the face of it, and Cynthia's gonna dig in first, I think, that when he has spoken publicly, people love him, right? They're like, wow, it's great, because you said, Cynthia, like, wow, you were ahead of your time, you saw what was going to happen. But it looks a lot more like he knew what was going to happen because he knew people involved with the planning of what was going to happen. Take it from.
Yeah. So again, like part of it was the cultural warfare part of it, and that's what Aldous really specialized in. So I don't know if we want to go through a little bit of the occult and the mysticism that
Absolutely.
influenced.
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
Go for it.
Yeah. Have
All
at
right.
it. Yeah.
All right. So another aspect of what influenced Aldous, which by the way, T.H. Huxley, one of his close Darwin associates, Russell Wallace, was involved in creating the I forgot the name of it's like a parapsychology branch that was founded at the same time as the Theosophical Society associated with William James. So this whole specific form of mysticism that the British also were packaging, which borrowed a lot from Hindu philosophy, but they really perverted it with a lot of Freemasonry stuff as well. And they also took, Plato, which I like Plato. They've taken some good things and they warp it in their philosophies. So they created a form of mysticism that, again, if you look at, if you want you want a section of your population that's easily controllable. H.G. Wells talks about the world religion, or one religion, or whatever. And he's saying that it's not a matter of believing, it's not a matter of understanding, it's only a matter of releasing yourself to it, to just submit. And the mystical aspect to any religion or spiritual experience, it partakes in that. So you feel like you're receiving something that's very substantial, it's profound, but there isn't any intellectualization of it. There's no comprehension. And so they were really studying this aspect of religious and spiritual experience, the mystical, and they were trying to fine tune it, package it, which Aldous Huxley is the culmination of that, really, with his Doors of Perception, where you can have like a fast track to what appears to be the secret mysteries, when, you know, really you're having, you know, certain types of emotions and fleeting insights possibly, but it's not really any kind of knowledge or any kind of empowerment. Because, you know, I've heard a lot of people really think that LSD was like the CIA screwed up when they spread LSD everywhere, because it was actually a wonderful mind-opening drug that was like super empowering for people, and they had to like put a lid on it. So there are a lot of people who still kind of associate this as like a form of empowerment, but that's the whole point of Brave New World with Soma, was that it was really just a way for you to kind of release certain things, and you think that you're in control. It rather focuses more on comfort, happiness, and to make sure that there's no type of frustration. So you have certain things that are open for you to kind of get that stress out or whatever, and so you can be contented that way. And the mystical, but where it gets complicated is that the elite also think that there's a mystical that they have access to that is the actual door to the secret mystery. So they have the fake mysticism for the peasants,
right?
And the insanity, mass insanity, because they believe that they're superior beings, and that they have a special capability to wield this special power. And so a lot of this started with the Theosophical Society, but also Mont Veritas, which it's like maybe too much to go through, but all to say is that Carl Jung was very influenced by this. Aleister Crowley's also had set up with Theodore Roos, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light Lodge, and another lodge in Switzerland, which were basically the base for the Ordo Templi Orientis. And people need to understand that the philosophy of Aleister Crowley and the whole network with Otto Gross, who's a psychoanalyst, a disciple of Freud. Carl Jung also came into this, a disciple of Freud, psychoanalyst. That this occultist anarchist, because it also has connections to Bakunin. It's really nuts, but they all overlap in a similar philosophy, which is it partakes in Satanism. And I actually was looking a little bit into Carl Jung's psychology of the unconscious. I just want to read something really quick for you, because I think it says so much about how Carl Jung, his whole worshiping of the sun, which is a major part of the religion of Mont Veritas, when he wrote the Psychology of the Unconscious, which is like his most famous book, he talks about this quite a bit. This is all because of Mont Veritas and Otto Gross, but he writes under the chapter Aspects of the Libido, he takes out a section of Faust. And there's this, I don't know if I need to read that part, but everybody I think is aware of Faust, Mephistopheles and Faust. Faust is like an alchemist who wants to kind of dabble in the secret arts. And what Jung makes the point is that when he's talking to the devil, Mephistopheles, Faust's is handed the marvelous tool, a phallic symbol of the libido. In this case, it was a key, but in another part, it's like a magic wand is supposed to be also a symbol of the phallic symbol. And they say, as once before in the beginning, the devil in the form of the black dog accompanied Faust when he introduced himself with the words, part of that power, not understood, which always wills the bad and always creates the good. So then Jung says, united to the strength, Faust succeeded in accomplishing his real life task, at first through evil adventure, and then for the benefit of humanity. For without the evil, there is no creative power. And I think that really sums it up with how they're thinking about their whole plan. And again, like you see this with Alice Bailey's work, which she's off of the Theosophical Society, in her like rays and incantations or something like that. They basically say, because Lucifer is the solar angel, that you need to bring about the darkness in order to have the light shine. So they're all partaking in this worshiping of the sun, but that the sun is actually associated with Lucifer, and that you have to do evil in order to partake in creativity. And I would say that that's like the underlying thing that they all kind of agree with. And D.H. Lawrence came out of that, and he was the mentor for Aldous Huxley. And that was a massive influence. So you have these two major, or even three things, I guess, that influence Aldous, which that really, you can't understand Aldous Huxley's mind if you don't understand those currents.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then what do I say? Do I continue with?
Yes. Well, I think what the audience might appreciate is that when we look at characters like Aleister Crowley, for example, they on their deathbeds, people like him and Anton LaVey had massive regrets, it said, and they, as they were dying, and as these demonic entities, or the demonic entity, began to drag their souls down into the underworld, the netherworld, if you will, what have I done? Something is wrong here. And this speaks volumes, Cynthia, to the dynamic that we're in right now with this great awakening, where the things that you're talking about have become currency, right? So this subject matter is so pertinent, and it strikes so strongly in people's hearts and minds because it is so very, very relevant. And I just wanted to say before you continue that when we look at people like Aleister Crowley, who used necromancy to develop a satanic framework to give elites a supposed portal into things like prophecy and seeing the future, that it is not the future based upon higher order. It's not the prophecy based on fundamental principles, yeah. That this is a prophecy based on deception, and this is a prophecy based upon which they then go out to try to make in the world through their own force.
And a prophecy based on the reaction they have to LSD.
Absolutely. Right.
Which exactly. is another part of it.
Right, exactly. And it's fascinating, the subjects that you're getting into, because there's so much to unwrap. Unfortunately, we do have time. Fortunately, that we do have time. But what I want to ask you then is, when we look at, the Crowleyan framework, which in a way you can say was parallel in its origin to that of Aldous Huxley, in looking at this idea of doing evil to know good, because Crowley himself said that we have to be like God, because they had this obsession, this narcissist ego obsession, that an individual human being not would become one with God, but would be God. And that's a very, very different concept. And they might sound parallel, but just like with Plato, you can warp Plato and you can make it be like, as you raised before. And yet at the same time, we know that when you take something and warp it that away from the truth, that is where evil comes from. So this idea that doing evil is creativity is a nonsense idea, because
Mm-hmm.
all power comes from truth, and all truth comes from
Exactly.
God, right?
Yeah.
And then from there, evil only takes the power of God and subverts it towards some
Exactly.
other ends.
Right. Oh, thank you for bringing up that point. Because yeah, that's a very important point, that there is no power in evil in itself, but it always has to take from a superior force, which is the good, which is the truth, and it warps it and it manipulates it. I would say also really quickly before we get into maybe the MK Ultra stuff and
Mm.
so forth, is that Evans, because Aldous Huxley talks a lot about the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And I actually just found this out last night, that Evans Wentz, who is the translator for, because it was originally Bardo Thodol, it's obviously was written in a different language. When he translated it, he changed the title, and it turns out that he didn't really know that much about Tibetan Buddhism, but he was more
Not surprising.
interested in, yeah, in like Hinduism, but also Theosophical Society
Hmm.
beliefs. And then you look into him a little bit further, and he at Oxford he met T.E. Lawrence, and it was T.E. Lawrence who sent him to the Orient on this whole what became now the development of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was really like, it became something that was also a fundamental, I would say, book for the counterculture. Like Timothy Leary was told to really focus on this as a form of a Bible, you could say, and he wrote his, I forgot what book it was, but it was very much focused on that. So it became like a really core instrument. And again, you see that it's tied into the Theosophical Society, because in part four, you see that it really is everywhere, and that this is no different from the Mount Verita philosophy, which again partakes in the Aleister Crowley philosophy. So it's no surprise that Timothy Leary, I have a quote from him where he says that he's a big fan of Aleister Crowley, and that, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. And then he adds, with love, right?
Hmm.
Which is not part of the law, but that's what a lot of people who have a warped idea of Aleister Crowley, like with love and so forth, it's not surprising that he was a big fan of his as well, because it all ties into this. But with T.E. Lawrence, you see a very clear involvement of British intelligence
Hmm.
involved with these mystical societies. So you've got, and there's rumors, right, that Aleister Crowley was also tied with British intelligence, which I think is safe to say. I haven't studied it, too closely, but I would say that that's probably true. So again, you see that British intelligence with H.G. Wells also worked for the Propaganda Bureau under British intelligence. You have also Arthur Conan Doyle was tied to the Theosophist type activities, and he was also with the Propaganda Bureau. So very clearly, the British intelligence is involved in this. This is part of the plan, a big part of the plan. I don't know.
Well, if I
So,
may, I mean, when you talk about H.G. Wells, for example, and that was that. Now he did the was it to the planet, the center of the Earth, or what did he do? 2,000 League. What he did a
Uh,
couple of
the Shape of Things to Come is
Shape of
probably
Things to
the
Come.
biggest thing.
That's
But
similar
he
to
also,
Bellamy's Looking Back. Yes,
and he wrote like the I don't remember each book by name, but the one of the books,
the Time
Science
Machine was
Outlook.
H.G. Wells, wasn't it?
I, he wrote a
Hmm.
version of that, because Jules Verne was an
Uh-huh.
inspiration of his,
Yes, yes.
and H.G. Wells was a really interesting writer until he became, more and more bitter with his age, and I think he kind of wasn't able to write that way anymore. But he wrote also 3 books that he clearly stated in his open conspiracy book that those should be the replacement of religion. And one of those books he co-wrote with Julian Huxley, which was, the president and the vice president of the Eugenics Society. And they made no secret that it was very much tied into depopulation. So from Julian Huxley was involved more in the, rational science.
Tell us, Julian Huxley is Aldous Huxley's
brother. And he was part of he was the first director general of UNESCO, and he wrote their mandate. So he was more tasked with the rational, pragmatic side of science, and Aldous was onto this more mystical side, but they were working for the same purpose. And that's
if I may, because I think what the audience now can see is so very clearly, and this is so fascinating, Cynthia, thank you, that the science fiction writers, much like science fiction today, that they were in the mix with diplomacy, with intelligence gathering, with people involved in social engineering and social planning, that these weren't just people writing an interesting story about bad things that may come, but they were actually involved in the societies and organizations and even paragovernmental structures that have delivered this system that we have. It reminds me so much of, maybe people have seen the film Children of Men. And in Children of Men, it's, there's something has happened. It's a fantastic film because the movie begins and there's a population crisis and no more people are being born. And a lot of people right now are going to see very strong parallels with the eugenics program and things that are going on. I won't say more, but people have this idea that there's something connected there with fertility. And if that were to become a crisis, when you look at, there's a far right conspiracy in France called the Great Replacement, which is this idea that the French government and really the British Empire and NGOs that control much of civil society in France, that they are trying to replace the population with non-French people. And now, when you look at Children of Men, you have a future dystopic scenario where France is in a civil war between French nationalists and Islamic groups, which are fighting in the streets of, it looks like Paris, or the suburbs thereof. And then you have, in the context of a fertility crisis. And from the same makers, they did a book or a film as well about how a former communist East German became the head of the International Bank of Settlements. And then how he was allowed to collapse the whole system. Right, it was like a Marxist plot to collapse the entire banking system. I would argue that we don't need Marxists to collapse the banking system. They're collapsing it on their own just fine. But nevertheless, what you touch on, it just there's so much to unravel and for people to dig into. I highly recommend these 4 articles that you've written. Now, is this the last in the series?
Well, I'm actually planning on writing a book. So I'm going to be doing more articles, but it won't be like a part of the series, but it's a part of the story anyway, because this one was just like revolving around Huxley. But then I realized how massive this was that I've decided that this would be a good, material for a book. So, yep.
Yeah, I mean, because when people will know Brave New World, and it's sort of right up there with 1984. Eric Blair, I guess people know as what's his name? What was his
George Orwell?
Name? Yeah, George Orwell. So he was an MI5 agent who served in the Spanish Civil War on the side of a small kind of Trotskyist contingent, or he was in the Civil War and was sympathetic to the anarchist and Trotskyist push, which some people say with some conviction, even though they had the same flag as the Russian side, as the communist, the Republican side in the Civil War, that they were actually so involved in sabotage that they might as well have been working for the fascists. adding to the claim that Trotskyists, work for fascists. And yet here you have this English guy who, for whatever reason, similarly to others in his milieu at the time in the Independent Labor Party, are enamored both with fascism and with communism, and they try to do things in the Labor Party. And yet, when we read 1984, very much like when we read Brave New World or see the movie, we're like, this is not a world we want to live in. So our first instinct, right, is to thank people like Orwell or Huxley for alerting us to these possible dystopias, right, that lay in front of us. But as you've so well articulated, that this is really not the case.
No.
No. Yes. Right. No, do go on.
I mean, George Orwell is another huge story, and I actually want to do some more work on him, because it's not really clear for me if maybe he was trying to change his mind later on. He was involved in the torture techniques in Burma that he describes in 1984. So Martin Seif had mentioned this in an article. Actually, he credits his daughter with this insight that that George Orwell is both the character Winston and O'Brien, the torturer and the tortured. And if you look at it, this upper level, I don't know how much time we have, by the way.
Plenty.
Oh, we have time. Get into it.
Oh, we have time? Okay. The way that they treat their own people is actually horrendous. So Julian Huxley himself went through electroshock therapy. He didn't have the best health, and he also went through several nervous breakdowns, because I think they were both under extreme pressure. The middle child, their brother, I forgot his name, Trev or something like that, he hung himself when he was a young man. And Aldous didn't want to send his son to Eton, which is notorious for really harsh programming of young kids, I would say. But they do this to their own people. Or you look at what Alan Dulles did to his two kids. He also subjected them to MK Ultra therapy. So it's really harsh.
But if they want to sort of get their kids or themselves into this elite, wouldn't they have to be above this system then?
Well, this is the weird thing, is that they drink their own Kool-Aid as well. They're because they don't partake in truth, because they're struggling, right? If you look, for instance, Aldous Huxley, it's very clear. But if you study any individual, they're very unhappy people. And in the case of Aldous Huxley, I think that he might have been studying Hinduism with maybe some genuine intention. Because, when he moves to California, he's very close with the Vedanta Society, Gerald Hurd, who later on, they both very much formed the Human Potential Movement, which later on is the Esalen Institute, which is tied to Tavistock, which we can talk about if we have time. But Gerald Hurd really got into meditation. So did Christopher Isherwood, which was in their group. And they were really taking in the teachings, but at the same time, they were totally warping the teachings. I'm assuming the Vedanta Society was genuine, because Krishnamurti, who's the big world teacher, he came out of the Theosophical Society, discovered by Annie Besant and some other guy in India, and was just taught by Annie Besant as a kid up to his adult years, and was sold as the Maitreya, the future Buddha. And then later on, he says, no, I no longer follow the Theosophical Society. I'm not the world teacher. But if you look at all of his actions, that wasn't true. He actually set up an Annie Besant school called Happy Valley School with Aldous Huxley. So that says a lot.
Happy
but it
Valley.
was only called the.
Wow.
I know
that's impressive.
It's a little bit creepy, but it was named Annie Besant in 2007 because they credit it, right, that she is really the founder of that school. And the Vedanta Society had made it explicit that they didn't trust Krishnamurti. And Alan Watts, who's this big guy in Zen Buddhism as well, like he has this talk with Krishnamurti and the Swami at the Vedanta Society, and their interpretation of Hinduism is only to take like what they can use basically to manipulate and control people, but they're skipping steps. But the thing is that because they think they're so elite, they think always, right, that they have access to the secret mysteries. And I think that there was a genuine frustration on the part of Aldous Huxley that he couldn't achieve enlightenment. I believe that he really was hoping he could achieve that. And so when he found drugs, he really thought like, okay, this is finally my legacy. And we can use this for the masses, but we can also, as elites, we can use this drug to tap into that door in the wall that is also based on an H.G. Wells short story.
So perhaps what you're saying is that maybe this sort of what's happening here is an overall picture that at some point in the second half of the 1800s, the elite of especially the West, but maybe now the world, essentially they have this inner maybe feelings of self-hatred and patheticness, but they also know that they're in the elite, so they want to sort of it's basically almost like a religion of narcissism, where they pick different pieces of other sort of spiritual traditions to justify some sort of religion where they dominate other people. Something like that, roughly speaking? Is that what's going on here?
I would say so. And also, you know, the British have always been very interested in the caste system in India. And I don't know enough about how that happened. I do think that there are genuine, very good teachings in the Hindu philosophy. And Vedanta is one of the, I believe it's 7 ancient schools of Hinduism, which maybe that's why Huxley and Hurd and Isherwood were there to subvert it, because Krishnamurti too, it seems, was trying to subvert this in Hollywood. It's like a battleground for like, you know, think tanks and influencers. But yeah, the caste system in India, unfortunately, it's an awful situation for anyone who knows like the untouchables up to the Brahmins, who are almost godlike. So I think that the British it's the Brave New World is a scientific caste system, right? So it wasn't his idea to bring in Hindu philosophy, but I think that's why it was brought in, was because they could see this. And also, you know, there are stories about Tibet too, where they had slaves and they didn't treat them so well. So there's like these common links to some of the corruption of these religions.
Was it, I mean, because when we think about the British Empire, and I compare it to, for example, Russians today, right? One thing that the English or really the British Empire did so well was absorbing and understanding the world outside of them and trying to find sometimes esoteric, sometimes occult ideas that existed within the ruling class, within indigenous esotericism within those societies, in order to sort of link up with them, but to dominate, to integrate them into their own intelligence structure, and then to create, as you said, like let's say a world religion of sorts. I know that Aldous Huxley, he has the perennial philosophy, right? So you have this idea, and there is it's a corruption of this Platonic ideal, because there really is, in a sense, a perennial philosophy, but it's completely at odds with the ones that the elites promote. And that's sort of like the plot twist, is that there are many different paths up the mountain to the one God, to consciousness. There are, and the world is a diverse and beautiful place. And there are these fundamental principles that connect all of us. But yet the world that the elites are doing, that they're trying to create, is where they do it through these intelligence organizations, through secret societies, to link up all of the worst ideas, right? So it's like, because there are bad ideas in every philosophy and every religion in the world as well, or there are techniques of rulership, to be more accurate, that elites have inserted into the various world religions in order to create hierarchical power paradigms which are non-meritocratic and unjust. So I think that that's so fascinating when you deconstruct it the way that you have. And could you tell us some more then how you think how this connects to what we are seeing today with the Great Reset, or with the discovery that many people are now coming to see that the elites in the US through Hollywood, through entertainment, are also connected to some of these same ideas and networks?
Sure. I want to say really quickly, because you stirred up some thoughts for me just now, that Plato makes the point in Gorgias that a tyrant is the most enslaved person, because they are most enslaved by their desires. They're not actually in control of themselves. And this is really a good way of looking at all of these people who worship power. And they will, they can get into these positions of power through obsession if other people are not paying attention. But if there is an organized good, they can't compete against it, which, I would say, that Russia and China, thank God, are largely on that side of history. And that, Aldous and others, they never were really interested in spirituality. Just like when Aldous studied Christianity, he was interested in Christian mysticism. So it was, again, just using these tools of control for people. But ironically, because these people are so mixed up, as I use that quote from Mustafa Mond from Brave New World, who is like the largest controller that we get to hear the thoughts of in the story. John Savage, the Savage, asks him, "Do you believe in God?" And he says, "Yeah, God probably does exist." And the Savage is like, "Well, why are you doing all of this then?" And the Mustafa Mond's like, "Well, he exists in our day because as an absence. He's not there." And that's, again, like a big factor to their understanding of things. Like they're really messed up, but they have no connection to purpose, no connection to the universe, which they've done to themselves as well, mentally castrating themselves. And the Savage says, like, "But that's your fault." And Mustafa Mond responds, "Call it the fault of civilization." And again, this is like a core thing of to bring about evil for good. They do think that they have to attack industrial nation states. It was actually made explicit by Theodore Roos with a National Grand Lodge. He actually had in 1917, I think, a conference talking about the need to address this. And how we see that today, well, I go through the undercurrents of the Frankfurt School, which again was a really big player in Hollywood. And Aldous Huxley was going to the, forgot her name now. Anyway, it's in the paper. It's a salon where a lot of the Frankfurt School people were also hanging out. And they were very much at the forefront of the attack on beauty, which is what laid the groundwork for much of the counterculture movement. Was the idea that it was the attack on the classical aesthetics, classical culture, and that classical culture now was supposed to be the oppressor. Classical culture was blamed for all of the hardships, the injustices, and so forth in the world, and thus we had to be like anti-culture pretty much. And that's where all of the ugly art came from, where all of the ugly writers like Camus and Henry Miller, The Tropic of Cancer. I read that as a teenager. It was like really a hard experience for me. It just like kills, any optimism you have of human nature. And this was a very big foundation for the counterculture movement, where there was no truth, and that ugly was the new beauty, and increasingly insanity was the new sanity, which they talk about in terms of what music can do, in terms of like, they take classical music, they take elements of classical music and they warp it so that it becomes addictive, but without a message really. And they were focused on actually creating schizophrenic like symptoms from this. I have a quote in my paper on it, but they have like several quotes. They were very explicit with their intention to induce that, which again you see with the counterculture movement. And then you have from the Tavistock side of things, like the work of William Sargent, who both him and Aldous communicated a lot, and they mention each other in their books and in their lectures and so forth. But William Sargent was studying tribal drumming, and Aldous also makes this point in his Devils of Loudon, which if anyone, there's like a 1975 movie on this. I wouldn't recommend you watch the movie, but you just watch the trailer. Oh my God, it's like insane looking. It's really satanic.
And what was it called?
And I was
what was it called?
Devils of Loudon. It's Loudun. I would just watch the trailer, but it was really messed up. And I was so surprised that Aldous Huxley was like that. Like he went there. I thought he was a little bit more careful with how he wrote. And so they're really again exploring Aldous makes the point that I would dare you to put the smartest people all into a hot room, like a sauna, and you just play this drumming and all of this and see if they won't be howling and capering like the rest of the savages, because he really felt like it just taps into something instinctive within you. Again, with D.H. Lawrence, he has the whole blood consciousness, which is a whole other thing, but that was something that influenced Aldous Huxley, and that, you know, it's tapping into something primitive that nobody can protect themselves from. And in that climax of that state, you are your most suggestible, and you can introduce dogmatic beliefs, you know, in that state. So they were always looking at like, how do you induce certain forms of trance so that you can increase suggestibility? And it's more effective than with torture techniques, because William Sargent was also looking at torture techniques, and it was found that the subject would reject it more often than not. It was not ever a permanent thing, because you have to have the illusion of free will. But it will work if it's an illusion of free will, if it's an illusion of free choice, but you have to think that you made that choice for yourself.
Well, I think we're going to have to wind it down here. We're getting close to the hour mark. Very interesting. This is probably our darkest episode so far. That's for sure.
I disagree. I think this gives a lot of hope. I mean, I you know, that it.
Well, Joaquin, my source of hope is that, you know how in Hollywood, pretty much every celebrity wears that little red piece of string on their left wrist, and they all have geodes and stone pyramids that are supposed to give them energy? Because in a way, they're all just slaves to trends, and they're all sort of caught up in this weird Hollywood culture. And I think that maybe what we're describing here is a natural trend associated with the misery of people at the elite, especially people who may be in the elite but aren't particularly successful, if that makes sense.
So I think not, when you're many people in the elite are not successful at having meaning or happiness in life, and they're a slave to their ambitions and to their wants, which, as Cynthia explained, is actually very much connected to tyranny. And I think that, you know, my takeaway from this, it gives me a lot of optimism, because I know that in this realm that we live in this world, and in this time, there's such a strong permeation of evil. And I think when people realize that it's not just bad stuff, but that it takes on supernatural dimensions, we understand in almost a kind of messed up way that there's the possibility of supernatural good. And once we see that we can see that there's supernatural evil. Like, we're the fighters of this time. Like, we're the ones living through this. And there are generations before that had better methods through classical architecture, through an understanding of fundamental principles that didn't live through times of evil. But we can see that the supernatural is real through this sort of dark, as you said, reversal of reality, which is supernatural evil. right? But that means that there's also supernatural good. And that's what we have to be in pursuit of. That's what we have to be looking for these fundamental principles and these things that connect all people around the world, really.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's also why that China is really prospering right now, because they didn't lobotomize themselves. They remember their history, despite, some of dark periods in the 20th century that was attacking some of that. They do overall remember their history. They returned to Confucius, which has a lot of parallels with the Platonic teachings. And I think that, when a people or an individual becomes oriented in that, that is where true power lies. And at that point, it's true, it's challenging to get to that point, but when you're at that point, the evil cannot oppose that. Like the evil is inherently inferior to that. It cannot create, and that's like the tragedy of Jung's statement, for instance, that you have to partake in evil to have creative powers. It's the opposite. And so these people are just kind of like victims of the former generation, which is always like, again, like you see how they treat their own people. They don't treat themselves well either. So it's a really horrible way of living. But it's like, it's funny that D.H. Lawrence talks about the blood consciousness and that like the blood remembers from like the past ages. Well, they certainly have that problem where they just keep reinfecting themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know, but I just would like to end this discussion on one thing. I can tell you one thing for sure, that every person I've ever met who uses drugs regularly is a complete freaking loser, and that is guaranteed, whether they're in the elite or not. Cynthia, thank you very much for being with us. Joaquin, it's always a pleasure to see you, and to our viewers, we'll be back in 1 week's time.